Hello and welcome to the Divine Renovation podcast, where we seek to inspire and equip you to bring your parish from maintenance to mission. My name's Dan Rourke, and I'm in studio today with Rob McDowell, coach of Divine Renovation things.
Hello, Dan.
How you doing, buddy?
Doing well.
And you know what? We brought in your successor, the person who took your place at St. Benedict Parish, who was able to fill your shoes and accomplish all that you were doing and perhaps even more.
Definitely more.
Kate
Definitely
Robinson.
more.
How you doing, Kate?
Hi, I was doing pretty well before that introduction. Now I'm feeling the stress.
Now you're feeling the stress?
Yeah.
So, Kate, welcome to the podcast. It's been a little while since we've actually had you on the podcast. Yeah. And the last time you were here, you actually held a different job title at St. B's.
It's true.
Yeah. So your old job title was?
Director of Communications.
And your new job title is?
Kind of undecided, but currently.
Kind of undecided.
Mission Support Team Leader is what we're leaning towards right now. We've, moved things around and have some new teams in formation. And so, Mission Support.
Excellent. So when we stole Rob from St. Benedict to be a full-time Divine Renovation coach, we left a small hole in the team over there.
Yeah.
And so I'm so grateful that you've been able to step up, take on some of the things he was doing. Yeah. But I do know that things have transformed. And so there's a few things I was hoping we could talk about.
Sure.
The first is I'd really like to understand how does that transition happen inside of a parish of a role, whether it's staff or whether it's a volunteer role. I mean, that's you guys transitioned a role. Rob, you were in it. Kate, now you're in it. So help me understand, what did it look like for you, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it was understood when I was hired that I was being hired for something that probably wasn't my ideal job. As Father James says, you hire for the position you have and you grow into the position that suits you. And so we're always changing. And the role did change as time went on to kind of fit who I was and how I was wired a little bit more. But at the end of the day, the job was largely administrative, and I wasn't necessarily the most gifted administrator on staff. And so I knew that was becoming a bit more of a challenge for me to emotionally, kind of engage around some of that stuff. And so I actually had a conversation with Father James about a year or so before he transitioned out, that I just said, you know what, I'm probably in my last 12 months of effectiveness. A year from now, you're probably not going to want me in this position.
How did you know? Like, in all seriousness, how did you, that takes a high degree of self-awareness to be able to have that conversation with your boss.
Yeah. And I've had that conversation in the past when it didn't go as well. But that's a whole other conversation. It was just, the energy that you have to do for things. And, I just found myself mentally and emotionally trying to have to put more into doing some of these things. And then you're aware of the things that you kind of gravitate towards that maybe isn't part of your job description or you're not able to do or whatever the case is. And so I just had a growing awareness around what some of those things were.
And so when you decided to join us here at St. Benedict, at Divine Renovation full time, and you still retain a role at St. B's, you're on the senior leadership team there, so I don't want to diminish that, but I mean, the most of your time now is focused on Divine Renovation. So what did that look like? How was that experience for both of you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've tried to do is obviously there's a tight partnership between Divine Renovation and St. Benedict. So as the conversation kind of came to the surface, I brought it to them at the team, and I just because
senior leadership team.
Yeah, and other people that knew me as well, because again, I think one of the mistakes you can make is when you're feeling overwhelmed or you're feeling frustrated or discouraged or whatever it is. Any port in a storm will do, right? And so you can jump into anything. And so I wanted to make sure that I had feedback from people that knew me best and knew what I could do best. Say, okay, is this a fit? Am I out to left field and things like that. And again, I'm passionate about several things, and so even some people outside of St. Benedict and some other ministry interests that I was considering, I was discerning around as well. Conversation with my wife, but ultimately at the end of the day. In the work context, the team at St. Benedict, I said, okay, here's what's being offered. You know who I am. You know what I do here. All that sort of stuff. Is this a good fit? And ultimately they all kind of spoke into my life. They saw this being a good fit for me. So that was one of the key aspects.
I feel like this is one of those times where the senior leadership team was there to support you through an important transition. Yeah. It's interesting.
And it helped kind of set up the transition rather than me just walk in and say, hey, everybody, guess what? I'm done in 2 weeks, or it wouldn't have probably been quite that way.
So you had more than 2 weeks notice, Kate?
Yes, which was wonderful. I mean, obviously we, have come to, know and respect and care for Rob so much. I mean, we're so grateful for what he's done at the parish, continues to do, and, felt, like he's got so much to offer, and it would be a great fit for him to be involved, to be able to impact the wider church and whatnot. So, but obviously less scary for me knowing that we had some time to talk about it and the fact that he wouldn't be gone completely. Rob's someone I've always, look to for, I often make trips to his office to just bounce things off him and that. So knowing that that's still an option and he's still there, with his wisdom and there. So
no, the common knowledge for us, but not for people who are joining us, is that Rob's office was actually a closet.
True.
So did the transition happen? Did you get the closet? Did you inherit?
No, amazingly, I've chosen not to
an
move into the closet. It's wonderful that he has that closet space. We've said, you know what, we'll even let you keep that closet if you'd like. It's full of bookshelves, which is wonderful. And he's maintained the closet.
The great thing about it is nobody else wanted the office, so it's I've had no problem keeping it. So
that's I'm not sure if I should congratulate you or just cry on your shoulder with you.
Anyways, no.
So did you guys talk a lot about the transition? Like, was there a lot of were you guys meeting deliberately about some of the things that were being handed off? Was there direct how did that process work?
I mean, there were conversations, like we were always trying to talk about what are the next hires, or what we're always looking at structure, right? And so we've talked about structure and things, and is our structure best supporting the mission and things like that. And Rob had some ideas about that, earlier on, that maybe some of us might have been more resistant to, like maybe me. And so, if I'm being honest, just kind of unsure. But again, I think I'm very grateful for how the whole thing has kind of gone. It's been a great journey and a great learning experience for me. And it's been interesting, but
so Rob, let me ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot. You ready for this? So if you were talking to a pastor or a priest who's transitioning someone out from a current role, and you're bringing someone in, what are 2 tips you might give them? 2 things that you would say, here's a couple things that would be helpful that you do in order to make this transition successful. What would be 2 tips might you give?
Yeah, I think the first is, I don't think you realize how often your identity gets connected to your role. And so I remember the first time they wrote Kate's name up, and at the time my title was Director of Operations, and so her current responsibility is kind of overseeing communications and operations, kind of morphed into one team, and hence the difference. But at the time they hadn't had that definition, so seeing Kate Robinson, Director of Operations, when for the last 4 years I'd seen that, was kind of like, oh, okay, and it was just sort of that, there's a bit of kind of that emotional, oh, yeah, okay, and just kind of internally. So I would say, be prepared for that. And maybe this is connected to it. You have to make an intentional choice to be differentiated and kind of suspend your emotions and allow the process to move forward, and deal with that in an appropriate way. And I'd had that happen in a previous position. I used to be, the title we used was youth pastor, but in Catholic context, be youth minister. And I knew the transition was happening, and I had been away. I was taking seminary classes, and I came back on a Wednesday night. I'd been out of town, and I walked in, and the guy that was going to replace me was leading the youth ministry that night. And I walked in, and they announced the transition that night, and I didn't know the transition was happening.
Oh, no.
No, and I just remember I walked in the youth pastor, and I walked out a guy that's still on staff at church, and I'd been doing youth ministry for about a decade, so a lot of my identity.
So don't do that.
Yeah, so a lot of my identity was rooted in what I did, which was a whole new feeling. So I left that night. So I'd had that experience before, not as extreme as this. Mm-hmm. And I guess what surprised me at this one though is Director of Operations and Administration. All that stuff, I knew that was never my strength, and so if there was any surprise, it was still a surprise. Like, I knew I stunk at it, and I knew I wanted to walk away, and yet I still had kind of that like, oh, but what am I now? Sort of internally going on. So, recognize emotionally how we tend to connect with our positions, and then be willing to step back, differentiate, and suspend your emotions in the moment, and just pull back and process. And I don't know if people who are more wired around counseling or pastoral care will talk about, the stages of grief or what, but just kind of allowing that to work through. And it's still different, like it used to be when I was responsible for the property, driving on in the morning, and you paid attention to different stuff and things. You had to have conversations with you. Now
when the roof leaks, it's not your problem.
Yeah, it's things like that. The first snowstorm, I'm going to be really excited because I'm not going to have to worry about any of that if it doesn't get plowed properly or all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we'll bring some donuts perhaps to Kate on that day. Her first snowstorm donut batch.
Yeah.
It'll be
but there was a little bit of sort of who am I now kind of experience in trying to navigate that a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So Kate, I understand that you guys are in the midst of your Alpha at St. Benedict Parish, the big one. You got a huge turnout. It's very exciting. Now, I heard a rumor that you guys are hoping to launch a Connect group at the end of Alpha, and that's part of the strategy now. Is that right?
Yeah. We're trying to be really intentional about ensuring that we have next steps, across the board for people, and trying to sort of, we've probably maybe mentioned it before, but the back door of, having opportunities for people to come in, thankfully through Alpha, and continuing to see that grow, and then want to make sure that we have something to offer people so we don't completely lose them when they've come in and whatnot. So Connect Groups is one of those important key aspects of the game plan where we hope to be able to onboard people into authentic Christian community for their journey. So yeah, our hope and our plan is, I have a team now that helps with Connect Group leadership. Like I kind of am the Connect Group coordinator, but then I have a team supporting me in that, volunteers largely. And we're talking about always wanting to have the launch of a Connect Group to onboard people from a big Alpha so that we have that opportunity.
So our Connect groups are mid-sized groups, right?
Yes.
20 to 30-ish people, and they're permanent groups, and they meet every other week.
Right.
And I've always found, because I've obviously served on Alpha at St. Benedict a number of times, I've always found that a lot of our guests are kind of hoping to get into one, but we cap it. We don't just let anyone go and form a Connect group, right?
Exactly.
What are some of the reasons behind that?
Because we have to be so intentional about the leadership, because essentially we're entrusting Connect Group leaders with small p, they're considered small p pastors. And so we really hope that, that they are, going to be, accompanying people on their journey, challenging people, providing a safe place. And, it becomes a family type environment is the hope. So yeah, our growth, is based on leadership and the ability to onboard people as leaders, and then hopefully grow the groups themselves. So
we're at 16 or so Connect groups right now.
Not quite.
Not quite.
I know that number was quoted in a homily on the weekend.
Okay, so we're
yes.
okay. Well, I'm going to run with it because that's the number I've got. 16-ish. We'll call it an ish.
Sure.
It's in that ballpark.
Yes. Exactly.
All right. So we've got 16-ish Connect groups right now at St. Benedict, and that means you've got, because each Connect group has roughly 3 or 4 leaders.
4 leaders typically.
4 leaders.
Yeah.
So that's actually a whole lot of how in the world do you invest in those people, those leaders, those small p pastors?
Yes, it's challenging. So for example, we try to gather Connect Group leaders monthly. So we invite them to our leadership summits, which happen 3 times a year. So they're invited to that. And then
leadership summits for the whole parish,
exactly,
anyone who's in leadership in the parish, which
exactly.
is about 100 odd people that usually show up for that.
Exactly. Yeah. So 100 people for those, but then Connect Group leaders gather monthly. And essentially what we do in those gatherings is it's the same format as a Connect Group. So the leaders can come together, and hopefully we're investing in them and hearing about how they're doing. We're also working on meeting with Connect Group leadership teams as a team, with the team of lay leaders leading it too. So yeah, we're trying to pour into people. We're trying to come up with new ways to say, how are you doing? How are you doing in your leadership? How is your Connect Group doing? Do you have room for new people? Do you need, what's your biggest need right now? And trying to speak into that to continue to foster growth. So it's exciting.
That's awesome. I'm so thrilled. I mean, I love my Connect group. It's in fact, I'll be missing my Connect group this week, and it's whose fault it is. It's the fault of our guest today. A true story. So I'm getting on a plane to spend some time with our guest, who's Graham Singh, and so I will be missing my Connect group meeting this week, and we can blame him when he comes on.
So we're going to take a brief pause, and we'll be right back.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Graham Singh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you guys.
And Graham, you're the leader of multiple organizations. And I want to make sure everybody has at least some sense of who you are. So you're the pastor of St. Jack's, and that's right. In Montreal, Canada.
That's right.
You're also the director of Church Planting Canada and the director of the Trinity Foundation.
That's right.
So you don't have much on the go.
Well, the great thing, and I hope we'll uncover this, is how these go together. The mix between local church, the wider networking we do, and my passion, which is seeing the church buildings that we steward actually used to serve mission and the local community.
I'm so excited to have you on because there's so many directions we could go in terms of our conversation, because you're involved in so many things that I think are aligned closely with what Divine Renovation is about and the way
Absolutely.
that we operate. So help me understand some of the things that you're hoping to see happen this year. What are some of the big projects you're involved in?
Well, maybe some of the connection for Divine Renovation listeners. My own friendship with Father James Mallon goes back many years to our mutual connection through Holy Trinity Brompton. We're both really inspired in our models of church leadership. So for me, at the core, I'm a pastor in the Anglican Church, and my heart is to see the local church come alive. And that's my main work in downtown Montreal. And like you guys, we use Alpha right at the core of that. So at the core for me is anything we can do to see the local church thrive. Mm-hmm. I believe within that, we have been handed a stewardship of some incredible urban assets. I call this actually the largest underutilized asset class in Canadian cities. I'm also a graduate of the London School of Economics, and I love thinking about things from that point of view. And of course, many of members of our congregations, key leaders, come from a business background. They look at this and they think, come on, we ought to be able to do so much better.
What assets are you talking about, Graham?
Primarily, I'm talking about our buildings. So if you look at where society is shaped, where all the people want to be with their new startups and their cool ideas, and they're in the downtown of our Canadian cities. Of course, there's good things happening in the suburbs as well, but people are wanting to be central these days, and they want to gather. They want to have more genuine connection points. And you look at the places where they want to be, where the municipalities want to be, and you realize, hold on, we have a whole bunch of pointy roofed buildings with steeples on top that we're not quite sure how to use. So those assets to me are actually what a lot of Canada looks at, and they think, we're not so sure what we think about the church these days. But man, we'd love to do some cool things in their buildings. And I'd love for us to wake up to that opportunity.
So in some of my own travels, and as I've gone around the world, not just in North America, but I'm finding that at least the Catholic Church, we seem to have a lot of, we have declining attendance. You know, we have buildings that are being underutilized, and bishops and pastors are struggling with this, and they don't seem to know what to do, and so but they're still trying to prop up the infrastructure. They're trying to be like, oh well, we're going to keep the building open, right? In fact, I was just talking last week to we have a seminarian who's with us, Antoine, and so Antoine's from France, and we were talking about we're doing a conference in France in 2019, and we were talking about some of the experiences there, and he said, well, one of the pastors I know. He's the pastor of 60 parishes, 60 churches. Yeah. What, six? Yeah. They said, no, I was sure it was a language issue. I'm like, can you say that in French? Because I'm pretty sure you just said 60, not 16. Yeah. And I was going to be shocked at 16. Yeah. But I mean, that's how many church buildings this one guy was going around propping up. Are you finding that? Is that similar across other traditions? What does that look like?
There are. I mean, we have in our Anglican tradition, we have a number of instances of that kind of situation. We have to dial what's happening with rural, urban, suburban onto that. So certainly in rural France, where my wife comes from, there are places where there used to be loads of people there because of the way that the agricultural economy worked, that nobody lives there anymore. So there's a problem of just basic urban shift. The world is urbanizing. But then within that, we're trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a priest? And similarly, in the Roman Catholic Church, these are huge questions. In our Anglican Church, in every church, we are struggling to know, what does it mean to see ordained leaders? We're talking about how do we release people after an alpha group? These kinds of questions. The great thing is we have the scriptures to go back to. We have Jesus and a bunch of fishermen, and we know that they figured it out. The book of Acts, 3,000 people come to faith in Acts chapter 2. They figured it out. The Holy Spirit equipped them. And I think if we go into this with not just glass half full, but glass is totally full, thanks to the Lord. And we know that he not only has a plan then, but he has a new plan for us now. I think going into it with that faith that there is a solution on that is a key part of going into this. And using every bit of brain power the Lord has given us. And I think that's a frustration for some people. I even heard one guy, he was in tears when we asked him to be part of the Trinity Centers Foundation. His family founded one of Canada's largest commercial real estate organizations. He said, Graham, my family's been in this business for generations, and I have personally. He said, I've also loved the Lord Jesus my whole life, but nobody's ever really asked me to use the gifts I have. When I do offer it, they often say, well, would you just kind of hold the door open on the... He's so happy to be a servant leader and holding the door open, but for heaven's sake, if we'd let him into that meeting. Right. And I think so many of our bishops, if you have a beer with them, or you have a scotch, depending on which denomination we're talking about here, maybe a coffee. Let's stick with that.
When I was with the Wesleyans.
You know, often I think so many of our bishops are dreaming and yearning, along with all the rest of us, to see these things happen. But when they get back into their office, there's actually a setup, a structure, which is working against a lot of the best dreams.
So you got to have to describe what the Trinity Foundation is for people who are listening. What is this Trinity Foundation you're talking about?
Yeah, so what we're calling this is the Trinity Center's Foundation. So we're saying a Trinity Center is an old church building that's transformed into a community hub while still retaining Sunday Christian worship. So it's not a completely deconsecrated building. We're going to try to find a better phrase than this, but there's places and times where we temporarily deconsecrate a space.
Temporarily
it's ugly, I know.
Place.
But I think people who think about this...
Is there a particular prayer for the partial deconsecration?
There is. It's a silent prayer. You just say, Lord, and then afterwards you do it again. Say, okay, it's holy again now, Lord. But actually, you know, the places where we go and proclaim the Lord's presence become holy by our presence in that place. One of the questions we ask ourselves theologically is, are these buildings more like Solomon's temple, or are they more like Nehemiah's wall? Because if they're more like Solomon's temple, we should be really worried about what happens in there. We should be very protective. They should be holy spaces. But if it's more like Nehemiah's wall, we should understand these are the places where agreements are made, where trust is built up, where relationships are formed. And Nehemiah, somebody said to me the other day, say, Graham, you shouldn't do this because, you know, Nehemiah did not go back to build the city. He went back ultimately to build the temple. I said, what? Which Nehemiah are you reading, man? You know, Nehemiah got his permission from the king to rebuild the city. And I think now as we look at so many issues in our cities and in our communities, we can find and be allied with people in the community. We call them sometimes our secular friends. It's one of those words I use less and less and less. It's like lay and clergy. These are phrases that I'm finding myself using less and less. Because in the city, we find, like Nehemiah did with the king, we find people who understand the brokenness of the city. And if we can ally ourselves with them, we can find actually the opportunity for friendship is much higher quality. From that engagement, I think we start to get some of the answers. So Trinity Center's Foundation is trying to say, let's see this new model exist where that's the way we use this building. It's community, but there's still worship. And trying to say, how can we actually create a new funding model around this? And probably one of the most exciting things around that has been working with some of the big institutional funds in Canada. We've been approaching them saying, guys, are you interested in this? Is this something you want to be? And they're saying, we're very interested in this because we're trying to see something like 10% of our fund assigned to what they call socially responsible investments. Those are investments where they can either measure the green impact on the environment or the social impact. And green impact is fairly well described. Social impact, nobody really knows how to measure it yet. It's a new area of investment. And what we're trying to say is, well, great social things happen when groups that are trying to build the city come together. So what if we located those in our buildings and you still made space for us to do our Christian stuff on Sunday? Well, that's something of what we're trying to do. So both the model and the fund is kind of like the holy grail. I don't mean to use that in too flippantly, but it's this kind of thing we're trying to find, and we know that people are looking for it. And so we're trying to say, everybody who's looking for that thing, let's get together in Canada and let's look for it together. And we're probably about 50 key leaders from around Canadian denominations, banks, social, entrepreneurial, innovation endeavors, and government. So it's a pretty fun stage.
I'm wondering, it's so hopeful hearing you speak of this. I feel like there's so much creativity that's happening and people using their gifts in particular ways. Could you give us like a concrete example of where the creativity of what you're doing has been able to be recognized in a community and what that's kind of how that's been shaped?
So I want to give a huge shout out to my bishop, Bishop Mary, who's the first female bishop of Quebec. She's an amazing leader, has an MBA from University of Quebec. And Bishop Mary and our diocese, I think, have taken what is maybe one of the biggest risks in Canada of letting me come over. Moi, je suis un pasteur anglican qui parle français aussi. Alors, to be in Quebec, like, it's like you're an Anglican minister who speaks French. Like, they kind of have to let me in, right? No, I'm just kidding. That's a joke. But honestly, we don't have too many ministers ready to do this work, but Bishop Mary's taken a huge risk. And the diocese have invested significant funds in allowing us to do this. So our pilot site, which we've called St. Jacques, Montreal, that's used to be called St. James the Apostle Anglican Church. We shortened that down because we could also be Saint-Jacques-l'Apôtre. So we're saying it's not Jacques, it's not James, it's Jax. It's kind of Montreal short form kind of thing. And I would say, honestly, the best place that I could point people to in Canada would be St. Jack's. I'm working on my Doctor of Ministry degree. Slowly, Dan, before you freak out of another thing but actually it's the thing that kind of binds this work together to say, how can we deeply think about this? And I would say what we're trying to do is see this building. We have 5 churches that share one building, including our own Anglican community. We have multiple community organizations that share. And now right away, somebody might be saying, hey, we have scout groups, we have AA groups, we have all these groups, we have concerts, we have... What we've found, and I've certainly found this in my research, is that we've so underbuilt our facilities. They're so crummy often that yes, those groups are present, but the amount of revenue they're bringing in is poor. And as a result, we're often not honoring people with our best spaces. We often are putting them in our crummy church basements that are a bit cold and leaky, instead of putting them in our sanctuaries and saying, you who are working with alcoholics, why would we not put that in the absolute prime space? The space that says this is the most important thing, that somebody would be set free from addiction. And somebody would say, no, hold on, the most important thing is the Eucharist. Say, yes, that's right. So on Sunday, it's all about the Eucharist. But actually throughout the week, aren't we seeing Eucharistic-like tendencies in the confession, in the receiving again of promises, in the setting free from bondage, in something like AA? So what we would find is, I think the business model versus the architectural importance could really use a kind of kick in the pants to get up to the kind of pace we'd like to see it.
So Graham, in the Divine Renovation model, our focus is always on mission. And our mission, of course, is to bring people to Jesus. How do we bring people to Jesus? And in fact, I think Father James's book, his first book, his Maintenance to Mission book, he talks about the card groups and how he kicked the card groups out because they were taking up space and he needed to run alpha, I think. And so how do I reconcile that position? Like we're about trying to bring people to Jesus. How do I reconcile it with what you're talking about?
I remember one of the churches. So it's been my privilege. It's been I've led 4 churches now as their pastor, and in our second church, I called one of my bishops. I said, Bishop Rick, we have 21 user groups in this church as we take it over, and we're trying to shut it down and start over again. So our model is a kind of slightly more extreme version of divine renovation, as in it's kind of like, let's be obvious sometimes when there's a bankruptcy. Like, let's close it down, let's shut her down. And I think I mentioned in joking, I'm sometimes not everybody's favorite person to come because I'm on the I've ended up taking on some of the harder cases, which usually means a harder shutdown. And I called Bishop Rick. I said, Bishop, how many of these groups should I keep? And he said, Graham, you're going to want to try to keep all of them, but you're probably going to find you should probably stop relationships with all of them and then rebuild those relationships. And that's probably been some of the wisest advice that I've ever received, because those groups are often fantastic. But within some of those relationships, in a broken church environment, just those rental or space sharing arrangements can be very dangerous. So I really believe in shutting them down firmly with love, with an open invitation to say, we would love to find a way of working with you really well in the future. But working with you really well means, hey, for instance, you have to adhere to our child protection policy. That's an important thing for us. We're all trying to learn deeply from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what we learned from residential schools. So we can't, for instance, just run a homeless shelter alongside a children's ministry. You couldn't put a homeless shelter in a primary school, could you? Just like that. You'd have to be very careful about how you do it. And we need to apply that same kind of care. And what we've found is that people who are invited into that kind of serious, mature, adult conversation, where we say we are starting again, actually great discussions happen. But man, I would say to somebody trying to do this, don't half try. Because half try can really be demoralizing.
Is this Bishop Rick from England?
Yeah.
I love that guy. I got to spend some time with him not too long ago, and he just
very wise,
he had some great wisdom and some hard words, to be honest.
Yeah,
because obviously in the Catholic context, and this our own diocese as we go through our restructure here in Halifax Yarmouth. I mean, I was talking to the diocese a couple of weeks ago, and a couple of people from there, and they're like, you have to think of the parish as a container, and inside that container, there's a bunch of buildings.
Yeah.
And the question is, how are you going to operate your container with the various buildings that you've got? And I think what you're proposing is to understand, Graham, like we've got buildings, how do we utilize them? And as we continue to have, challenges around getting the right pastors in place or having enough pastors to lead, that becomes a real issue. And I think we feel it a bit here in Halifax, Yarmouth. And I know we're not the only diocese. There's plenty of dioceses, plenty of people listening who are struggling with the same thing.
One of the things that would come from some of those hard words have been some of the hard situations I think we've all faced. And when you hear about somebody talking about, a situation of leadership that's resulted in abuse of a young person or a vulnerable person, we're all dealing with that. It doesn't matter if we were in the parish where some of that happened. If we meet somebody that we want to talk to them about our faith, sometimes the first thing they mention is, well, what about that scandal? In our case at St. Jack's, my not previous minister before me, but the one before her was actually killed by somebody he'd been involved with in an inappropriate sexual relationship.
Wow.
It's a little bit even harder than that, but it was a very, very bleak situation. I mean, think about how a community could respond to that. One of the answers is actually there are some situations a community cannot respond to, and it is more faithful to speak the Lord's resurrection power and hope over a situation and say that expression of church needs to end well in order for us to start something new. And so for me, Divine Renovation, we've encountered a lot of those kinds of situations. I'm so thankful to the work that you and Father James and the whole team have been doing on this. But I think in talking about some of these hard issues, it's helpful for us to say to people, we know how hard some of those situations are. And actually, it's okay in some situations to close down well in the hope of something new coming.
So we've got a lot of pastors that we connect with, either connected with us through the association or our network, and then others we just encounter all over the world from when we do events and travel. And, I do hear one of the same stories I hear a lot is, a pastor's got a number of different buildings, he's stretched too thin, can't manage it all, there's financial challenges. What kind of advice would you give to a pastor like that, especially one that's propping up a bunch of built infrastructure? Yeah. What kind of advice would you give to that guy?
Well, one of the things I remember saying to Father James many years ago was, James, how many priests have just asked you to just come and live with you? Just come and hang out, in Halifax. And of course, that is part of the fruit. I wasn't the only person asking Father James about that. You all have built this environment where actually I think in the Roman Catholic Church, this is one of the most incredible environments where you could come and be refreshed. My encouragement to that priest would be to make sure that they're having that conversation with their bishop and their synod really, really well and really, really seriously before they embark on coming on a path of renewal here. What I mean by that is acknowledging, don't we do this in the confession? Isn't this part of our liturgy where we make sure that we get as a community to the bottom of the root of sin? When we say, this has gone wrong, we've sinned, we've strayed away from you, Lord, please help us to turn around. And I think when we're dealing with some of the most difficult parish situations, that priest could go to their bishop and their synod or other representatives and say, isn't it possible that this is almost an impossible situation? And if we could recognize that, would you give me the opportunity, Bishop, to kind of have a blank sheet? And would you give me really the opportunity to try this? I'll work with the best mentors we can and the best coaches, but can we have a real clear run at this? And I think that preparation, that recognition of how bad a situation is, in the hope that God has given us, actually is one of the best things we can do. And a lot of corporate leaders, business leaders, they would tell us exactly that. I can't quote the exact quote from Jack Welch from GE, but he talks a lot about the kind of leaders that he trusts are the people who can describe what's gone wrong best. I think sometimes we try to put on, literally, new wine into old wineskins without saying, hey, let's recognize we need a new wineskin here. So I'd say recognizing something is there, then finding best practice. And as Divine Renovation grows, I'm so excited. Dan, you mentioned the thing I'm dragging you away from your Connect group. I promise we're going to pray together. We're going to read the Bible. I'm going to make the sign of the cross when we pray with you and me. We're going to do that a couple of times, brother. I do that most times, but we'll do that together. And I want to say, I think that as Divine Renovation actually comes back onto, I think you guys can be ambassadors to parts of the church that may not have had a Roman Catholic presence. And I don't mean you're representing in a kind of Episcopal way and anything like that, but just in a comrades kind of way, to be out with other people who are trying to crack the same codes. There are other churches where maybe the Roman Catholic Church, there hasn't been such a good connection. And I'm saying that as an Anglican. We always see ourselves in the middle of like, you guys are our brothers and then everybody else is our brothers. But I want to say, I think connecting with other churches could, and of course this is an obvious thing to say, right? Connect with other churches is a good thing to do. But I mean on a much deeper basis to say, how could we minister alongside each other? I think recognizing and learning together are probably two of the most important things for me.
Graham, in this journey that you're kind of on in trying to help churches not just close down or sell, or how can we make best use of our buildings, where do you see some of that fleshing itself out? Like, do you see multiple denominations working? What are some of the other success stories or some of the examples that you've kind of come across with that?
Well, we were talking about one of my favorite stories is actually from you guys, actually from the Roman Catholic Diocese in Quebec City, who was sharing a building with a Pentecostal church in the afternoon. And they turned around and said, actually, we can't sustain this building. We're going to sell it, but actually we'd be willing to sell it to you. And they named the price. It was higher than they could have otherwise afforded. But the Pentecostal church turned around and said, what if we keep you guys in here on Sunday at 4:00? And the Roman Catholic community said, well, we would love that. And then, by the way, we would offer you a price that was like a quarter of what was previously offered. The Pentecostal church got their money together. They didn't quite have enough. And the diocese actually lent them the remainder of the money to buy the building. So now this Pentecostal church has this mission station. And this is the best part of this story, is they then looked at all of the statues, the icons, the elements of Catholic worship that they would otherwise just want to come in and remove, right? Yeah. They looked at those and they thought, given the grace we've been shown, ought we to remove all of these things? Or ought we to leave them for our brothers and sisters who will be worshiping here in their own building at 4 p.m.? And they left all of those things in place. I'm sure they made a few amendments. I probably made a few improvements. But that story of camaraderie I know that's been presented to the College of Bishops in Quebec and in Canada. And it's been presented, I can tell you that story, I've presented it to the Southern Baptists in Atlanta. That story has gotten around. And I think telling great stories is one of our...
It's funny because as you're talking, you're talking about the Catholic Church, you're talking about the context in the Anglican Church, another kind of mainline. Coming from the evangelical background, and I never planted a church myself. I was part of teams that worked on staff after churches were recently planted. But you tend to think in terms of, how do you do ministry without a building? And so often it's in a growing context. And so my mindset is, you walk into a movie theater and it's like, how can we do a church here? Or you walk into some community space. And so for people that are on the other side, and I know we're probably talking mainly, what would it look like to create partnerships with maybe church plants of other denominations that are looking for space, particularly in downtown areas? Because I know a lot of denominations now are focusing in on city areas. Historically, it's been easier to start churches in the suburbs, and we've largely ignored city centers, downtowns, things like that. And so, what would be a word for churches that maybe you've got this big empty building, or the occasional church planter that might be coming across this podcast, whatever it is, to create those partnerships?
So Rob, I love that question. And that it kind of ties together. I mean, when I first meet people and explain that, have these kind of couple of different parts of leadership, sometimes it doesn't immediately come together why those things go together. But through your question, it really does. Because to me, those organizations that are planting new churches, some of them have really rethought what it means to do mission in this age. They've really rebuilt the car engine, and they've got some incredible tools for us as together, the kind of kingdom team in Canada. Their basic assumption is to go and rent a space. So that's why they'll go. And here's a funny stat. Cineplex Odeon, 25% of Cineplex Odeon.
That's our movie theater here in Canada. Yeah.
There we go. Is 25% of their non-film business. So all the stuff they do other than show movies is renting to churches.
Wow.
So they are actually one of our main sponsors for our conference for Church Planting Canada.
Wow.
Right? And we hold half the conference in a Cineplex facility.
That's amazing.
Right? We hold part of it in an evangelical church, part of it in the Cineplex. We're really hoping actually that we're going to be holding part of it at a Roman Catholic building nearby. I can't say much more about that right now, but Dan, I'm hoping you're going to help me pull that together. But that's the kind of picture we want to have. But here's what I want to say. The reason they like that is because the toilets work, the screens work, They even have parking, which is a nice trick. Yep. And things work. They're reliable.
Yep.
And so for one of us
comfortable
mainline
seats.
churches, comfortable seats. I don't like the seats to be too comfortable, though. I don't like people sitting down for too long. But for those of us who have big buildings that we're wanting to use, I would say the condition, the quality, the lighting, the way the doors open, actually it all matters to a space, because we're trying to bring people out of a city where things work, right? Yeah. And they come into an old church building and think, hold on, you're telling us the King of Kings is responsible for this building particularly, yet nothing works in this building, and it's like a 40-watt light bulb like hanging from a string. Like, this does not add up. So the condition of the building, to me, needs to come up to attract those church planting groups. And actually, they could be a significant source of revenue in the right situations. I guess ultimately what I'm suggesting, though, is even a church that says, well, let's just rent out a bit of our space, because a lot of churches are doing that. In a lot of the buildings we're looking at, I don't think that's enough to make the revenue model work. I think we're really looking at Monday through Saturday, finding what effectively look like, I said I wasn't going to use this word, but secular uses, people who are willing to pay good amounts of money for beautiful space. And I think we probably need to set up a different way of engaging with those. And that's why we set up the Trinity Centers Foundation. We're going to be running actually a webinar coming up. We'll probably try to attach the data that in some way to this notice, to this podcast if we can, to say to bishops and denominational executives, how could they consider being part of what we're trying to build, to see if that might be of service.
So let me respond in the way that I see our problem, and by our problem, I'm owning the entire problems of the Catholic Church in that statement, which is a little more than I signed up for on this podcast. But the problem I've encountered over and over with especially in conversation with a diocese, whenever I talk to people from a diocese, and certainly across North America, one of the things they struggle with is they have to sell off property. They're selling off property, and they choose to sell the property that's going to give them the most revenue, which is property in downtown city centers. And so I keep encountering that over and over again. We can't afford to keep the building, Dan, so we're going to be selling. We got these 5 properties that we're throwing up for sale, and it's going to be mowed down into a parking lot or a new office building or whatever is going to become of that space. What would you say to all the dioceses, people from dioceses that are listening?
So I'll give you, this is not exactly against the directions of my board, but this is against the directions of normal, kind of research and development. I'm about to give you our current status of our secret sauce for the Trinity Centers Foundation. What we're really trying to come up with is either what they would call a co-ownership or an asset management model, where we would say, let's take that building and let's think with a diocese to think they're already thinking of multiple options, right? One option is miraculously it all just works again the way it used to. And honestly, people kind of hope that would happen. They're like, if only 200 new people came and they all tithed, it would all be fine. The hard part is when they realize even if that happened, it still wouldn't be fine given the other costs that are going on. The second option is you find, well, here's a way of developing a little piece of the land. The worst one, the kiss of death. And if I could say, I don't know if I get to look at the camera, whatever camera I can look at,
Pick any camera,
to say, do not sell your church hall. Right? You sell the church hall.
Do not
well,
sell
on
your
the other
hall.
side of the church, people are saying, like you're saying, Kate, it's going to be all about young families, reaching families with little kids. So if you've now trying to put all those kids into the sanctuary and you just sold your hall to build some housing there because you thought that is a stopgap measure. It is palliative care. It never, ever works. So option 2 would be develop a piece of land on the site, but do it right without crushing the mission of the church. Option 3 might be something else we haven't thought of, 4, 5, 6. But the final option is none of it worked. None of it worked. We have to sell that site, rezone it, and promote it as something else. That's what a developer does when they buy a church. What we're trying to do with the Trinity Centers Foundation is we're trying to say, let's take any play the developer would have in their kind of playbook. Let's pull that into the foundation so that we can share that with the diocese and with the foundation and actually do that better. Our assumption is we can do that better than a developer because we're bringing so many developers who are Christians into our team. Not all of them are Christians, by the way, but some who are saying, guys, you're not going to make any money on this. We want you to volunteer your time, your expertise. And some of them who are not Christians, actually, they're doing the same thing. So it's a kind of funny way in which this has been growing. But we're saying, guys, we can probably get all the expertise that would happen if you sold it. So don't just sell it. And often what's happening with dioceses is we're selling these buildings almost in the dark of night, right? Like one day they're here, next day they're gone. And somebody in a diocesan office is kind of thinks that's probably the best thing because if only people knew the complexities of it, they wouldn't get it. And I guess we're trying to say, come on, we're trying to bring a lot of things out of into the open, increasing transparency. I think we need to increase transparency on this. That's what I would say to a diocese, to say, come on, let's pull out the life cycle of this building and let's find a way of journeying through that together.
I think your solution is so timely, especially in the Catholic Church and certainly here in Canada and in North America, because what you're identifying is like these bishops are struggling under the weight of the diocesan teams. They're as we retreat to try and draw a new line so we can venture forth. And so much of our work is like, let's venture forth. But we also have to recognize there's a degree of retreat that a diocese often has to do. And so in that retreat, there's all sorts of options and decisions that are being made. And some of them are so critical.
Yeah.
And it's tricky because like dioceses don't have a lot of experience in this. The people working on a diocesan staff, like God bless each and every one of them. The load must be unbelievable.
Do you know what happens, Dan? Sometimes there is somebody who comes on with experience. So they'll say, let's hire somebody with experience. Yeah. The problem is you put that person in a system where, so we've met some of the property experts that we've become friends with, and there's some experience that I've brought into this as well from my own family experience. A good idea is something they will work on with a team of 10 people for a week. They won't talk about anything else but that idea. Yeah. You try to put that into a diocese, you get one interesting property person. Maybe it's a volunteer or a kind of staff member type of person they put on. That person's got like 1 hour and then a committee meeting and half an hour in that committee to work up that idea. There is no way that they're going to be able to compete on that level of innovation. Mm-hmm. So the idea is to say, the expertise is one thing, but it's also the structure in which it's placed. I mean, I love that you guys are here. Look at you, Divine Renovation. You're hugely part of what's happening at St. Benedict Parish, but you're also set up here to be able to reach the world and have just a different perspective. I love the way the interaction between these two organizations, but you've realized the structure is important. That's the bit within our diocese where a lot of people will say, right? They'll use a shorthand. They'll say, for heaven's sake, why doesn't somebody set up some kind of property entity that really looks at this properly? And then the bishop, quietly while on retreat or walking through their diocese or driving down the road, I think so many bishops are thinking to themselves, I just want to be a pastor of pastors. I want to release my ministers in mission. I don't want to be a property company, but I am, and I don't know how to do that. I think we have to look at this more seriously and say, let us set up an entity which is dedicated to this work, which can benefit the diocese in that way, so that that bishop can be that pastor. And frankly, I want to set it up so I can go back to being a pastor. I can see this thing happening, but I hope, like many times in my leadership, I hope people will come along behind me and say, Graham, thanks for the idea. This is great. Foundation's great, but we're a lot better at this than you, so would you mind just moving away? I'm very happy for when that day comes. But right now, I feel like we're not grasping the nettle on this. And I think many of our listeners today will be kind of amening. Even I can even imagine some Roman Catholic priests just shouting, amen. And many, many lay people who are saying, we've been dreaming this. Come on, we've got to do something about this.
So for all those pastors, priests, diocesan people yelling amen, Graham, where's the best ways for them to look up the Trinity Foundation? Where are ways they can chase you down to learn more or to connect with you?
So this is all in aid of pre-launch. We've worked out that front page news is not something that, we're not worried about when this reaches the Globe and Mail or that kind of thing. We're trying to do all of this in pre-launch. So this season, we are setting up webinars for each of the major Canadian denominations that owns buildings. Mm-hmm. We're putting messages through to houses of bishops, colleges of bishops, to let them know that this is coming. And before Christmas, and if you check out the link attached to this, we'll be able to confirm what that date is. We'll be having a webinar for Roman Catholic diocesan executives and bishops. That's one place for those folks. The other place is our website, trinitycenters.org, and we have a newsletter on there. What we can't do right now, and what we've been getting a lot of requests for, is people saying, I used to belong to this church. I know there's nothing happening there. Can you just go there and like wave a wand and make it happen? Unfortunately, like we've got some more homework to do on this. If somebody is incredibly wealthy, now would be a great time to donate to the work, to do this. And those who are involved in structuring funds, those are the kinds of people that we're looking to particularly learn. So trinitycenters.org. I'd also welcome you, as many people do, like they do here at St. Benedict. Like if you're in town in Montreal, come worship with us on a Sunday morning, see what's going on, come and experience and see what our pilot site looks like, and just journey with us in prayer. Please, for heaven's sake. These are like kind of concrete blocks we need to move in prayer. But when you think about the many times, think about Nehemiah's journey. Was it any harder or, Actually, Nehemiah faced the same thing. He faced a city in ruins. And we look at many of our churches and we think, honestly, it feels like so much is in ruins right now. And I look at that and I think, God, I actually prayed one time recently. It's like, Lord, have you ever seen anything as weird as this? And I felt rebuked. I felt like the Lord, as I looked through the scriptures, I felt like the Lord saying, are you kidding me? Have you not read your Bible? Do you not realize how many bizarre situations there are? So I would say to people, come into this in hope, in prayer, in positivity, but also honesty to say, come on, let's address this together.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Graham. Thanks so much for all the things that you're doing for Canada, for Montreal, certainly for the kingdom. You're opening new doors and you're opening minds to new approaches and ideas, and I think that's so critical. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much for this time.
For those of you who've been able to join us, it's such a blessing always to have you along. And I ask you just to raise us in a quick prayer as the podcast ends, and just pray for our ministry and for Graham's ministry as we continue to grow together. We'll see you again next week. God bless.